Hello, and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. And I'm Erin Popelka, and I am so delighted to be here today with author Leni Zumas. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you, Erin.
Oh, so a little bit about Leni Zumas. She is the author of Red Clocks, this beautiful book that I will bring closer to the camera, a novel which just won the 2019 Oregon Book Award for Fiction and was also named a Best Book of 2018 by the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the New York Public Library. She is also the author of Farewell Navigator, a collection of stories, and the novel The Listeners. She lives in Portland, Oregon, where she directs the creative writing program at Portland State. So much good work, but let's start with this beautiful book right here between us. Let's talk about Red Clocks. Please tell me about the book.
So it's set in Oregon, on the Oregon coast, and it follows the fates of 4 women in a present day that looks a lot like where we live now, except that abortion is illegal again in the US, and so are different kinds of fertility treatments, and there's a lot of kind of family values legislation going on, quote unquote family values. And so these women are navigating that, and then there's also a 5th woman who's a polar explorer in the 19th century that one of the present day women is writing a biography of. So it's a kind of multi-strand narrative, but all the women's lives are entangled with each other.
Oh, so interesting. And what a timely question, which of course has been timely for a while. So when did you start writing the book, and how did that play out with some of the current narratives that are happening?
Yeah, I started in 2010 and sort of Obama won. And I didn't finish it until spring of 2016. That's when I sold the book. And I still did some revisions after that. So I was fairly horrified to see with the Trump administration kind of what was happening in terms of the book's legislative imagination coming true. And I think that's in large part because I was taking my sort of speculation from actual lawmakers in the US Congress and governors, like when Mike Pence was governor of Indiana, he was calling for personhood laws that would sort of give rights of a citizen to a fertilized egg. And so it was a kind of strange, like not really cognitive dissonance, but almost like overlapping times, because a lot of what I was researching when I was writing Red Clocks seemed quite on the fringes and sort of this marginal, almost like grassroots, like internet community that wanted to grant personhood to fetuses. But now that thinking is a lot more in the mainstream, and it's especially with the current Supreme Court kind of makeup a lot closer to being reality.
Yeah. Very scary, very scary.
Yeah, but and again, as you say, I mean, these aren't new questions in terms of people having sovereignty over their own bodies and what happens inside them. That whether we're talking about histories of like enslaving people or kind of sort of reproductive coercion, and where women aren't able to make decisions about when to have kids or whether to have kids, because the flips, I mean, it's not really the flip side. There's also a lot of questions about motherhood in this book. I mean, it's not a book about abortion per se. I mean, that is a huge element of it, but more broadly, I think it's about narratives that we inherit about our lives, like what's a woman supposed to do with her life, and how that is going to, I mean, obviously that's going to be based on where she comes from, class and race and geography, but these narratives about, oh, you'll feel more fulfilled if you have a baby, and that's not true for everyone, and yet we're kind of given the idea that we're supposed to at least, want to have that. You know what I mean? So
definitely, yeah. And they are really complex questions that all women grapple with many times along the way, many stages of their life. And you do a really wonderful job in Red Clocks because you have 4 like perspectives that we follow in the present day, and then one, as you mentioned, in the 1800s. And so you get to see kind of different angles on some of those questions. So tell me about writing all of those different characters and how they all emerged, and how it was like to work with those perspectives as you were crafting the novel.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons I like working with multiple perspectives is I don't get as bored when I'm writing. But in this book especially, I wanted there to be a lot of different perspectives on the same questions, and so there's a character who has a couple kids and she's married to a guy, and another character who really wants to have kids but doesn't want to be in a romantic relationship, and a 15-year-old girl who is pregnant and doesn't want to be pregnant. And so it gave me the leeway to try on different voices and kind of syntax and diction, and really jump around, because I'm not a linear writer, so I would maybe write a sentence or a paragraph on one character and then switch over. So there was a lot of reorganizing and revision. I mean, it took me so long to revise this book, because
I'm sure,
like, just the intervals between characters and like when to bring in certain plot points, and plot is the thing that am least kind of attuned to. But with this book, I had the help of a great editor who really kind of helped me keep up the pressure on some of the conflicts and sort of things that were gaining steam and developing. So, and there's a courtroom trial at the center of it to give it sort of this like narrative scaffolding.
Sure. And certainly, like, the way it's constructed is incredibly well put together, because there's lots of echoes that happen in the beginning that come in later, and seeing characters through, you get their perspective, but then also you're seeing them from the perspective of others. And so that play works really well, and I imagine that was like, lots to keep track of in the revising of the book.
Oh yeah, and I do things like I'll keep track of like how many times I mention a certain word or image or phrase, and I like what pages it's on, and just so that there's not like a huge cluster of them at the beginning of the book and not at the end.
Sure. All the fun. Thank goodness for find and replace and word, right?
And so you're writing, or you finished a novel, right? Are you in the midst of revising it, or is it already revised?
So my book is officially revised and is currently seeking a publisher. So it's with my agent and currently looking for a place in the world, which is, it's been super fun. So certainly these craft questions I actually really enjoy talking to you about, hearing your perspective on too. And so speaking of actually like interesting things that kind of keep coming through and keep weaving through, I'll go back to Red Clocks. There's this wonderful theme about the Salem witch trials that comes through, and it's both like directly mentioned and also certainly played with. So tell me a little bit more about that theme and how the Salem witch trials like wove through for you as you were thinking about and writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, the original title of the book before Red Clocks was Notes for a Witch Trial, and I was thinking a lot about sort of historically, like how we inherit a world that is built upon, I'm speaking in the United States, built upon a society that at various times, and arguably still today, really fears women's power and kind of casts suspicion and blame on women for kind of communal woes, and so obviously the Salem witch trials were a huge kind of manifestation of that. But when I moved to Oregon in 2011 and realized I was living somewhere where Salem was like the capital of the state, I'm like, oh God, I definitely have to use that, because originally when I started it was before I moved to Oregon, and it was set in some random Atlantic coast town. So I don't know, I think a lot about kind of what we inherit and also what we owe to women and people of color and non-binary people and kind of any sort of activist or regular person from groups that have not had power, right, and have been really pushed to the margins of society, and the ways in which like their strategies and skills for not just surviving but thriving and making art and making political change. And so thinking about witches and the persecution of witches to me is a natural jumping off point for that.
Sure, absolutely. And so embedded, right? Like the stories of the Salem witch trials, like we have been carrying for the last 300 plus years, right? Yeah. So interesting.
And witches are kind of like trendy now and like sexy, and which is fine. I mean, I'd rather that be true than, I don't know, frat boys or something being more trendy, but
and certainly the persecution element too is actually incredibly present, right? Both with the Salem witch trials, but then also, as you mentioned, there's a court scene in the book, and then also in this bigger question of like the persecution of women who want to get abortions that is just like embedded in the premise of the book that abortion is no longer legal.
And we have people in our in our government today in the U.S. who want to make abortion a murder charge, right? And it's amazing to me when I see, you know, especially at the state level, state legislators calling for, let's change the law so that a woman can be charged with murder if she does this thing, and notions of like what that means, like the woman herself is in the eyes of someone that legislator, like an incubator or a sort of staging ground for someone else, right, rather than her own entity, like her own person. And it's just sometimes I think it's almost like too depressing to think about that we're still having some of these, or you know, crucial debates in 2019. But I was thinking about that a lot when I was writing the book, like how our identities as women are so bound up with our like physiology and like our kind of reproductive capacity.
Sure, absolutely. And certainly that there is a clock like that, you know, ticks for us that doesn't tick for men in the same way. Yeah, absolutely. So we just sort of touched on some of the big questions that surround this book, and I know that there's been a lot of really great discussion since it's come out into the world, and reviews and in literary circles, and I imagine that you've had with readers. So tell me a little bit about some of the discussions that you've had, and what of that has surprised you or resonated for you or has been absent.
Well, a couple things have stuck out. I mean, I love hearing from readers, and often readers do write to me and just talking about why the book resonated for them. It might be something in their own experience around whether it's like infertility or miscarriage or motherhood or not being a mother. But also a lot of men have kind of really responded to the book. Like male readers say, oh yeah, it's so interesting to see, you know, this, like they've sometimes, not always, but sometimes focus more on the male characters and how, you know, like there's one of the characters in Red Clocks is this sort of hapless, like aging hipster guy who's married to this woman who does most of the child care and house care. And this one guy said to me, he's like, I really hope I'm not like DDA, but I think that I might be, you know, like I don't know. I mean, I think what hasn't, and one of the reviews that was critical of the book mentioned the fact that there are no transgender characters, and that, you know, a book about reproductive rights or reproductive coercion like needed to have trans characters, and I, you know, I think about that review a lot, and about ways, like, you know, whose bodies are we talking about when we're talking about abortion rights, or especially with the history of feminism, at least again in this country, there's a you know, there's a lot of unfortunate precedent for like white women sort of pushing out women of color, or, you know, not acknowledging difference enough within a feminist movement. And so those are valuable things for me to think about. I mean, with this particular book, it's set in Oregon, and I really wanted to kind of focus on whiteness as focus on is the wrong word, but have the characters kind of be really coming to grips with their own whiteness and how that sort of affects their fates. So I don't know. I mean, I love hearing different perspectives on the book. I think book clubs seem to really respond to it. And one of the reasons is I think because there are these 5 main characters, and, you know, it's like, well, which one are you? Like, who are you most similar to?
Sure.
That is sometimes the conversation.
Sure. Have you been to book clubs and visited book clubs and done direct conversations?
Yeah. Sometimes in person or through Skype I visit. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
So great. What a treat. And thank you for doing that. Like, many must readers are in book clubs.
Yeah.
So
I love book clubs. I mean, I'm not in one myself, but after this experience, like I kind of want to be, because I'm like, and sometimes like you meet people, like, you know, groups of women who've been doing it for like 20 years together, and I just,
amazing.
I'm so envious of them. You know, to have that camaraderie, but also the camaraderie is like structured around something that changes, you know, so like their friendships are kind of intimacy stays the same, but then they keep having new books to read. So
amazing, like a literary family. Like
Yeah,
after
yeah.
20 years, that's
Yeah.
great. That's really great.
Are you in a book club? Or?
You know, I am in between book clubs at the moment.
Okay.
Yes, but also it's always interesting too, like how groups come together, and oftentimes it's friend groups, and it's so interesting how many different takes you can get on the same book, you know, and what people come to it with, and the ones that people love, and the same ones that people hate, and like you know how that all plays out. It always makes for really interesting conversations.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that's great.
Yeah, a lot of the, I mean, I'm not going to give away any like spoilers, but the kind of relationship between the biographer and the daughter, and the choices that are made there, like often readers will be like, well, why didn't this other thing happen, or why did it turn out this way? And it's a hard question in a way for an author to answer, because part of the answer is simply like, because it did, you know.
Right.
But I know, I think I know what's underneath that question, you know, as well.
Yep, for sure. Well, certainly your characters go on very authentic journeys that, you know, what happens in the end, it's satisfying, and I'm also not going to give anything away, you know, but there's also a deep authenticity to it, just to return to that word, right? Like, you know, it doesn't always have to be like the happy ending with the bow on top for it to be satisfying.
Right.
So, fantastic. So, my last question, you on your website have a really fantastic page called Gratitudes. And I encourage most readers, please do check it out, because it's this wonderful list of all of these incredibly powerful women, you know, kind of both contemporary and more historical. And so I'd just love to take a minute to talk about both why you chose to have a page about gratitude, and your thoughts on gratitude, and why those women.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm trying to remember, it was before my book came out, and I was building this new website, and I was thinking like, well, what is the internet good for? Like, what can I represent here about myself as a writer that, you know, I would be harder to do like in just text or something? And I was thinking, well, I could represent a lot of the influences and inspirations that have nourished me as an artist, that kind of helped me write this book, so to speak, like my literary foremothers. I also happen to be a drummer, and so I wanted to include women drummers who, when I was younger and kind of starting out, especially not just, I mean, I was a drummer in punk bands, and that was like a very sexist kind of environment in the 90s when I was doing it, and then even in the aughts when I was in a different band. But drumming in particular is like a pretty masculine position in a band, or at least it used to be. And
a lot of music is pretty masculine too.
Exactly. So, you know, when I was coming up, and there were a few, you know, female drummers I could look at and be like, oh my God, like I want to be like her. And I think that again, when we talk about representation, that's such a huge thing, because, you know, if you don't see yourself represented in a possibility, then like it's so much harder to think that like that could be yours as well, you know. And what I'm saying is so obvious, but like it also is very meaningful for me to think of the writers, and as you mentioned, some are contemporary writers, or some are like Virginia Woolf, or Octavia Butler, or you know, Nellie Bly, like people, you know, older sort of eras of writing that really nourished me. And I don't know, I feel like I think that was the Gratitudes thing was also a response to my ambivalence around like self-promotion, because I think there's such a culture that we all participate in to some degree online of, here I am, like here's me, and like look at me, and it's I did and do want my book to find its readers, but I also kind of feel really uncomfortable still about the sort of ego performance. And so I think kind of looking beyond myself and saying like, okay, well, I might not be doing what I'm doing if it weren't for, you know, Audre Lorde, or, you know, Anne Carson. So
yeah. Oh, well, fantastic. Well, thank you for shining the light on all of those fantastic women. Thank you for writing Red Clocks, which, must readers, please do check it out. It's an incredibly compelling read.
And thank you for doing this, because I mean, one of the best uses I think of the internet is actually around like literary community, you know, and, you know, there's this amazing book blogger or vlogger I know named Russell, who I just feel like he loves books, and you love books, and like being able to connect with people around that like is a really good good thing to do. So thank you.
Oh, it's truly my pleasure. I do feel like one of my personal missions is I feel like fiction is a really fantastic form of like empathy, like in terms of it's one of the few ways that we can really shed our own skins and feel the skins of others because we are so locked in our own bodies. And so I love fiction as that conduit to other experiences. And so I really do feel like, you know, promoting fiction as almost empathy medicine, right? If that's sort of a thing. It's you know, one of my mission statements, right? It's almost like a social practice that I consider for myself. So
no, that's beautiful. Can I ask you one last question?
Of course.
I've started asking people this because I realized I am very curious about where do you read?
Where do I read?
Yeah.
So I read. So for a long time, I always just carried a book around with me, and there was a while where I was a bus commuter, and I got so much reading done on the bus, which I was actually, that was the one thing that was sad when I stopped spending so much time on the bus, was the reading definitely dropped. I do a lot of reading right before I fall asleep. Like that's definitely a spot. Certainly with travel, I have a little bit of airplane travel with my other occupations. So certainly that goes along. And then I find it like this delicious thing when on like a weekend afternoon when it's like, there's all these other things, but I'm just gonna read. And for me, it feels like this gift to myself. So, that's like, and then I could keep going.
Of course. No, that's cool.
But we'll pause there. That's probably good enough for now. Where do you read?
Mostly, you know, in bed. So when I ride the bus, if I'm not driving into work, but again, I don't have a good reading chair, and I need to like figure that out.
It's time. But it's hard because it has to be just the right chair and feel just the right way, and there's probably certainly an aesthetic thing that goes into it, and like
ottoman, no ottoman, Anyway.
Yes, it is a good challenge. I wish for you a fantastic reading chair to enter your life. Indeed. Well, must readers, please do check out Red Clocks by Leni Zumas, and thank you so very much for speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me. Bye.